to my digital talk. Today's topic is the US approach to China. My guest today is Rachel Rudolph. Let me introduce Rachel very shortly. Dr. Rachel Rudolph possesses more than 10 years in academia and the media. She served NGOs in the areas of humanitarian assistance and provided consultation to a variety of actors across the globe. In academia, she has taught a range of courses focusing on foreign policy, intelligence, national security, and specialized in non-traditional security courses such as counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, human trafficking, refugees, and irregular migration. She presently lives and teaches in Zhuhai, China. Welcome, Rachel.
Welcome. Thank you for inviting me to chat with you today. It's such a pleasure. I should also note that it's been a very, very long time since I've talked about politics in such a format. I think the last time was in 2012, back when I was living in Saudi Arabia. So let's hope that my rustiness does not show too much. Before we start, though, let me begin by telling your viewers that although I have lived in China now for almost 2 years and the Asia Pacific region since 2013, I'm not a China specialist. My area of specialty is strategic security. I've spent more than 10 years focused on studying and observing the use of violent and nonviolent tactics by state and non-state actors in the Middle East, the mobilization of resistance movements and terrorist groups, and Saudi counterterrorism policy before transitioning my research to focus on the Asia Pacific region. After my last Saudi project was complete, I focused exclusively on strategic security and non-traditional security in the Asia Pacific region. My interest in and focus on China has been on U.S. security cooperation in the area of non-traditional security. I presently teach both traditional and non-traditional security issues for a joint program between Bryant University, which is located in Rhode Island, and the Beijing Institute of Technology in Zhuhai. The views that I expressed here today, the research that has been done, are that of my own.
Thank you for this clarification and for adding these interesting details to your biography, dear Rachel. So let us start with the most interesting topic from my perspective. That is the strategic approach of the United States to China. Now, if we remember last year, so the 2019 was already, and it was prior to COVID-19, that's why I wanted to stress this, was already marked by a certain shift in the strategic documents and strategic thinking of the US authorities. Now, recalling the press conference by the US Defense Secretary Esper, speaking to the press, he outlined a vision for the Pentagon. And if we look at this press conference, it was one topic that was again and again mentioned, and it was China, China, China. And on the other side, of course, it was not just China-centric declaration, but it was also Indo-Pacific focus. As per the Defense Secretary Esper was not alone in this message. The outgoing head of the US Navy was equally clear that his force has increased activity, specifically in the Indo-Pacific region. Standing alongside Esper, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, also noted that the Pentagon has adopted a kind of a new global orientation in its contingency planning for threats coming from where? Now, on the one side, of course, is expected Russia, but adding to it, China. So obviously, the paper by the White House that we are going to discuss, and this will be my first question to you, the newly published paper by the White House is building on this 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, and is outlining a certain US approach to China, right? Now, I would like to ask you, what is your assessment based on these strategic documents? What is your assessment about this US approach to China? What are the main findings? What are the key points from your perspective? So please analyze these strategic documents that I think seriously reflect a shift in the strategic thinking of US towards the region, but also towards China, particularly.
Yes, as you mentioned, on May 20th, to let your viewers know it specifically, on May 20th, the Trump administration delivered to the U.S. Congress a report titled "The U.S. Strategic Approach to the People's Republic of China." The report itself outlines the administration's thinking and its approach to China, which it calls a competitive approach. The document, in my opinion, is important for two reasons. First, the previous administration did not explicitly outline a China policy. Second, it finally accepts and recognizes the U.S. relationship with the PRC to be one of great power competition, and I think that's really, really important. And as you've highlighted, alluding to the press conferences, I mean, that's where this administration has taken the U.S. itself. In the previous administration, it was recognized, but yet it wasn't accepted. It wasn't necessarily said publicly that the nature of the relationship between the two countries is one of great power competition. So I think this document is important because it's the first government document that explicitly states and recognizes that it is now of great power competition. What I would like to do before we start talking about some aspects of it or assessing the document itself, I'd like to spend some time to go through some of the important highlights of the 16-page document, focusing specifically on the rationale for the approach, its aim, objectives, and key economic and security challenges and implementation. Now, I'm only going to focus on the economic and security challenges rather than the value-oriented challenges from the document, since they'll be relevant for later when we talk about NATO and the NATO BSEC members, okay? For the rationale, the administration argues that a new competitive approach is needed because of the policies of the past 2 decades has failed. It was commonly thought that deep engagement with China would lead to economic and political opening of the country, a more open society, and a government that behaved responsibly in international affairs. Instead, the administration argues, China has exploited the free, open, and rules-based order to reshape the international system and transform global order, and it uses economic, political, and military power to coerce nation-states. A competitive approach, the administration argues, will therefore help the U.S. to better its vital national interests, and as defined by the administration's national security strategy. The approach has 2 main objectives. The first is to improve the resiliency of U.S. institutions, alliances, and partnerships so that they can prevail against the challenges that China presents. And second, to compel China to cease or reduce actions that are harmful to U.S. national security interests, as well as those of its allies and partners. The document raises about 8 economic challenges, and those economic challenges include things like poor records of economic reform, state-driven protectionist policies, exploitation of WTO membership, distortion of global prices because of massive industrial overcapacity, unfair advantages given to Chinese trade and investment firms, violation of intellectual property rights, cyber and economic espionage, use of the BRI to reshape international norms, standards, and networks, and to coerce nations to toe Beijing's political line. As I'll mention later, these economic challenges are similar to those which have been raised by some of NATO members, particularly those who argue that China is a non-traditional security threat to the alliance. There were about 5 security challenges that were raised in the document. They include the use of intimidation and coercion to eliminate perceived political and security threats to its interests, provocative and coercive military and paramilitary activities in the Indo-Pacific region, military buildup that threatens the U.S. and allied interests and poses complex challenges to global commerce and supply chains, dual-use technologies that allow Beijing to suppress its population, China's national security law, which allows Chinese security services to access global information and communication through Chinese-owned companies such as Huawei and ZTE. These security challenges fall into the realm of non-traditional and hybrid security challenges. Again, some of them are similar to those that are raised by others, both within NATO and the EU. Now, let's turn to implementation of this approach before I end with some of my main takeaways from the document. According to the administration, implementation requires cooperative engagement with multiple stakeholders. It defines those multiple stakeholders as U.S. Congress, state and local government, private sector, civil society and academia, and foreign allies, partners, and international organizations. I want to pause here for just a moment before talking about some of the actions highlighted in the document, because the reference here suggests an intent to employ this approach or strategy unilaterally, bilaterally, and multilaterally. And I think this is important to emphasize because the Trump administration has pursued its foreign policy in many ways unilaterally and bilaterally as opposed to multilaterally. But the document in and of itself highlights a multilateral framework in which you can use all three mechanisms for its implementation. So some of the things that are, some of the actions that are highlighted within it include identify and prosecute malign actors for theft, hacking, and economic espionage, which we see that the administration acting on this already. Protect against malign investment in foreign threats, seeking to influence American policy. You see a lot of this with the creation of the CFOS, already next, responding to disinformation campaigns and promoting awareness of Beijing's failure to meet its international and treaty obligations, as well as inconsistencies in its narrative. I think you see a lot more of Secretary Pompeo doing this aspect, calling out some of the inconsistencies that it perceives in the narrative. Next, preventing malign actors from accessing U.S. information networks. And again, here for the administration, you see this in its bilateral discussions with countries attempting to discourage their adoption of Huawei and ZTE. Next, preventing counterfeit goods and halting substandard products from entering the U.S. market, and countering China's provocative actions in the region, more specifically in the Indo-Pacific region, and use of coercion against American allies. So let me conclude this very long answer with some of my main takeaways. First, the wording used to articulate the approach captures some of the common sentiments among U.S. policymakers. Past approaches are no longer sufficient. There needs to be a new approach that better reflects strategic competition and engagement for relations between the two actors. And I want to highlight here the notion between strategic competition and engagement, because one of the aspects of the document is it opens the door to where we're not the United States is not saying that it doesn't want to engage. Even when the discussions about decoupling, it's not about disengagement from China, but rather engagement at a different level, engagement on an equal footing of major power competition. Next, the second main takeaway from this is that economic and security challenges raised within the document are those that have been raised by the U.S. Congress across party lines in previous administrations. This is going to be important when we think about actual implementation of the documentation or the document funding for U.S. foreign policy and U.S. Congress. The third takeaway is that the document strategically captures all the ideological traditions within the U.S., with both U.S. policymakers and the public following too. This is important because strategic documents that transcend the political and ideological divides within the United States tend to have a stronger impact on U.S. foreign policy direction than others, which means that the shift to strategic competition between the United States and China is likely to extend beyond this administration. And in fact, going back to the Obama administration, it had already began. It just was not formally recognized. Mm-hmm. The last takeaway here was that, like this administration's national security strategy and the national defense strategy, this document highlights the administration's preference for maintaining strategic predictability while keeping open the door to the use of tactical unpredictability to meet its aims and objectives. And I think this administration has been really unique in this component when assessing not just policy towards China, but policy towards North Korea and in other areas, is attempting to maintain those strategic principles of policy in a particular area, but employing unpredictability at the operational and tactical level. And so this is just reinforces what was highlighted both in the National Security Strategy document and NDS in that specific approach, that specific operational and tactical approach.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting indeed. A lot of insights to be gained thanks to your analysis, dear Rachel. Now moving to, and you've mentioned already some key details, but I would like to expand it a little bit, considering the Trump's administration. Now, last week, Trump held a very important news conference on how he actually described it on China. And this conference actually marked the end of a rather cautious approach to Beijing, in a sense that negotiations were being held on a trade agreement prior to COVID-19. So we have to stress, I think, also for the audience, that a lot of the issues were already on the agenda prior to COVID-19, and COVID-19 was a great accelerator of issues, but also exacerbated the bilateral relations to a great extent. So in this conference, also in this China conference, so to say, Trump basically marked an end to this rather cautious approach and openly addressed the issue China. He also, to a certain extent, addressed issues such as visa restrictions on Chinese students, rather soft issues, but not unimportant for long-term comprehensive relations between the first and the second major economic powers. So visa restrictions on Chinese students, or he also declared a withdrawal of the United States special status for Hong Kong as a separate trade and customs territory. As well as he also addressed a kind of an unspecified pledge to later sanction officials. So sanctions policy is something that we know actually from the U.S. relations with Russia. So not a new element in the U.S. approach to certain countries. that are considered as being rivals or competitors, but certainly a new moment in the US approach to China. And in this context, I would like to ask you what in your view are the key elements of a so-called Trump's administration approach to China as compared to Obama's administration approach to China. If we take this one mandate, we are not going to speculate whether Trump is going to win in another US election, or if not, what the next US approach would be, for instance, by a Democratic candidate. But there is certainly a shift, and you've outlined it with your assessment on the strategic documents. So could you give us an idea about these new elements also of the Trump's administration approach to China, as seen from the last few years?
Yes. Before I address that, I want to mention something. Working in education, and more specifically, working for a joint American-Chinese program, the visa restrictions. Now, the visa restrictions, because we should be careful when we talk about them, because they target specific universities and specific disciplines that students are studying in. So. Many of the students that from China that go to the United States are studying business and they're not going to be impacted at all. So it is very specific. It's very targeted, which is important, because when we look at U.S. universities, Chinese students make up the majority of international students. So they're not only an important source of revenue, but it's also a good source of people-to-people relations. It's a way in which we were able to maintain a nature of relations at a sub-state level. Some of the other things, even in terms of sanctions, when you look at the way in which they're being used, those sanctions are also being used in a very targeted fashion. More so, when we look at the Department of Treasury's use of sanctions, whether that's China or whether that's North Korea, you've witnessed over the successive administrations become more targeted, more strategic in nature, so as not to cause significant disruptions in our allies' business or trade relationship with China itself. And so I think that we can say that this administration, but I would also bring it back to a lot of these things, as I've highlighted with the new White House document. A lot of these things began in the previous administration, and this is because what we're talking about the bureaucracy, right? We're talking about, or what some analysts refer to as the blob. There is some consistency to U.S. policy, and U.S. foreign policy is able to function because of the existence of that blob. Not that I'm giving props to it, but it's important to highlight that fact, because it's not complete. This approach itself is not completely new, and so I really want to emphasize this because of the hyperpolarization that exists at the present in American politics, and those analysts, scholars, and government officials that work within the bureaucracy, they're there it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, and so there's some consistency in that sort of. So now, with that, let me now turn to your question about the approach that's been put forward by the Trump administration as compared to the Obama administration. The administration's approach, as I've mentioned, is similar in terms of its aims and objectives, which is why I started off with that. And even in terms of its open-ended framework for working either unilaterally or multilaterally for its implementation. A big difference, though, as I've already mentioned, is that there was no articulated administrative policy towards China. China was engaged bilaterally while also multilaterally through Obama's Rebalance to Asia approach, but it did not articulate a specific policy approach toward China. Nonetheless, the approach that the Trump administration did articulate does have its roots in what has come before U.S. policy, even before the Obama administration. There's some consistencies going back to the Bush period. Another difference in the Obama administration is that the Obama administration went out of its way to avoid verbally confronting China. It preferred quiet diplomacy. That was its preferred choice. The Trump administration, on the other hand, uses confrontation as a tactic to bring attention to specific issues, which ends up mobilizing debate within Washington and Beijing. I know some scholars go back and forth, and some analysts go back and forth about the use of Twitter, or Trump's use of Twitter, the videos that Secretary of State Pompeo does talking about specific issues. But at the same time, if you compare the nature of facilitating debate, there has been more debate on key critical issues in this administration than in the past. Now, talking about the issues and actually sitting down and resolving the issues is a different matter. But talking about them is important, because in the past administrations under Bush and Obama, the U.S. government officials attempt to tiptoe around certain ones because of thinking that it would bring an end to either cooperation on another key area like North Korea, or bring an end to the nature of dialogue itself. So the confrontational component has been one of the things that has made, and it's done tactically, has made this administration different. At times, though, the administration or key administration officials' use of that has resulted in fostering more tension, rising to the point that makes dialogue on some issues almost impossible. Another way that I see them as being different is the importance given to multilateralism under the Obama administration versus the Trump administration. I think one of the things that this administration you see more so is pursuing a unilateral and bilateral approach before multilateral. It almost seems as if a multilateral approach is pursued as a last resort. But that it also depends on how we're looking at this, whether we're looking at dialogue with dialogue at a working level, or whether we're looking at dialogue between at a high level. So there's variation in there. The Trump administration has been more willing to go alone, as mentioned, not fearing to raise tension to the brink before taking a few steps back. Unfortunately, though, the abrasive way in which President Trump himself has publicly addressed leaders has complicated the administration's ability to work within a multilateral framework, simply because others are hesitant to work with the U.S., particularly given the inconsistency between policy positions and actual policy and actual behavior. And I think you see this in Europe, which you could speak to more about that, where you see traditional European allies to the U.S. taking a step back from the administration because of not just the abrasiveness in the way in which policy issues are presented, but then also the inconsistency in action itself, or meaning going to say you're going to do one thing, but then actually doing another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is a good transition to my next question, because you've mentioned the European allies, and I would like also to touch upon the NATO's approach to China. So last summit, the London summit in December 2019, was of particular importance for the allies on both sides of the Atlantic, because it marked also the alliance's 70th anniversary. And as expected, China was put on the agenda. So Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg stressed the need for NATO to fully recognize the country's growing influence in Europe, in Africa, and the Arctic. This was actually one part of the discussion. So the London Declaration spoke of opportunities and challenges in the relation to China. And for the first time, also the Public's Republic was characterized as a potential strategic threat to the West. The stress is put on potential. And I'm just laying out once again the strategic document and the discussion about it. So it's obvious that in particular the United States has been pressing for for certain shift also in the discussion, in the debate between the transatlantic allies on China. But on the other side, if you look back to the history of the alliance, it is this organization that actually has the experience in dealing with strategic rival. In the past, this was Soviet Union. Now, there is a certain potential for a new kind of a global power competition, and this is already mentioned in the strategic documents, as you said. But having in mind that NATO is probably one of these organizations from the Cold War era that really has the tools, not just the understanding, but also the tools to deal with this kind of comprehensive rival, having the capacities, the abilities, the capabilities actually to be operative in many various fields. I think that this is just the beginning for NATO to discuss the topic China within internal circles. Now, my question to you is regarding NATO specifically. What do you think are really the possible opportunities and challenges that Beijing currently presents in the international relations from a NATO perspective? Could you speculate a little bit as to how, and also point to probably already existent discussions within the transatlantic community when it comes to these opportunities and challenges coming from Beijing from a NATO perspective?
What I'd like to do is I want to talk in this context. To answer that, I want to talk about the debates. Before I do that, though, I want to go back to the London Declaration, which you mentioned, and I think the London Declaration is really important, and it really highlights the ambiguous language within the document itself. Highlights the debates that are going on internally into NATO. Now, let me qualify before I begin this, because I am not a NATO specialist. I do not focus on NATO. Our joint project is what is taking me into European security. I, prior to that, have focused on security in the Middle East and security in the Asia Pacific region. So I'm coming at this from outside in. So to try to get a better grasp of the nature of the debates, because it's really in the debates where we need to look at to see where there can be a meeting of the minds in policy and in strategy and how to go forward. So there are some striking components to the declaration itself that I found interesting when thinking about the document that we started our talk today with, which is the White House approach. So what as you've highlighted in the declaration, that it was unique and significant in that the alliance members recognize that China's growing influence in international policies present both opportunities and challenges that the alliance needs to address. But the declaration itself did not highlight the specific challenges of China to the alliance. Instead, challenges NATO faces were discussed more broadly without reference to a specific state actor except for Russia. Some of the issues or challenges that were raised in the declaration include, of course, Russia's aggressive actions, terrorism, state and non-state actors who challenge the rule-based international order. Now think back to some of the challenges raised in the White House document, in the Trump administration highlighting that China as being presenting a challenge to the rules-based order. Referencing instability and irregular migration, cyber and hybrid threats, security of critical infrastructure, communications, and energy, and then human security. Now, I want to pause on this since I teach on non-traditional security, but also because I want to say that human security is going to be particularly important in the post-COVID period. I think we're going to hear a lot more discussion about human security and the impact of human insecurity on those hybrid security threats, the combined traditional and non-traditional security threat. I also think that this is an area in human security where NATO could find some common ground with China for strategic security dialogue. And this is also on my mind because of one of the recommendations that Ian Brzezinski made in his recent article for the Atlantic Council, which I'll mention later. But I first want to highlight some specific challenges that some analysts have raised regarding China. Specifically, analysts have mentioned the heavy investment in European infrastructure and cyberspace, ownership of major European ports, which are critical to NATO operations. And I'll also add here something that I had found when I was researching the BSEC countries and some of the concerns that were raised by the BSEC countries was the dual use capacity for some of the ports, for some of where Chinese companies have purchased or managing particular ports. Security of communications, including 5G and unease with Huawei building mobile networks, cyber and economic espionage and intellectual property theft, China's growing partnership with Russia, and more specifically, its growing partnership in the areas of energy, telecommunications, and military relations. Threats to boycott companies and countries that criticize policies and the leveraging of debt instruments against poor nations, and maritime claims and aggressive activities in the South and East China Seas. Again, if we think back to the challenges raised in the U.S. strategic document, there are commonalities. The challenges also highlight the debate among NATO members, which is similar to a debate among U.S. policymakers, which is whether China poses a direct traditional security challenge to the alliance. Most argue no, that it does not possess a direct traditional security challenge, but rather it poses a non-traditional security challenge to the alliance. The alliance members who view China as non-traditional security threat argue that the growing economic dependence of the countries within the alliance threatens cohesion among member states. It hinders NATO's ability to conduct future operations and opens the door to the use of soft power to indirectly influence outcomes in multilateral institutions such as the EU. Those in the opposing camp argue that China is not per se a threat and that the economic challenges are not within the purview of the alliance's mandate. Here, I thought that was fascinating, and I think there are two issues that are being raised in this debate. The first is there are members who do not want to define China as a security threat, even if it's only being considered as a non-traditional security one. The second is related to the larger debate on the types of security challenges that should be the focal point within the NATO mandate. Also, non-traditional security challenges are touchy national security issues that raise nationalistic tensions when they are a focus by regional or international organizations. Today, though, with COVID, many of the voices claiming that China poses a non-traditional security challenge not threat, but a challenge, have been elevated in the policy circles. I point to Mark Leonard of the European Council on Foreign Relations in one of the articles that he most recently wrote, which I think is useful for others to read. He makes the case that Europeans should be more insulated from the whims of unreliable, and I'm quoting here, okay? I'm going to make sure I emphasize that this is a quote, that Europeans should be more insulated from the whims of unreliable or overbearing governments, whether in Beijing or Washington, D.C. So I think that's important because when we think about the nature of the declaration, the ambiguous language, the debates that are taking place, it suggests that it's going to be a lot harder than many would think to get a common document, a common policy document on NATO's policy towards China. I do think that eventually that there will be a NATO policy towards China, but I think it's going to be it's going to take a lot longer than what some actors are anticipating.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your recent research on Black Sea economic cooperation countries. Let me just point to this article for those who would be interested in reading it. It's called NATO, China, and the BSEC-4, Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. And it can be found, it's freely available and can be found on the webpage of the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs, or just go to the Twitter account of Rachel or mine, and we can also gladly forward this article. And in this article, you also basically assess the current relations of these countries with China. Now, these countries are NATO members, but then again, it's a very interesting geostrategic area. The Black Sea Economic Cooperation encompasses countries that are NATO members or European Union members or European Union member candidates, and it's also is centered actually at a very geostrategic hotspot that is between, geographically seen, between the European Union, Turkey, and Russia. So it's going to witness a lot of dynamics, a lot of geopolitical and geoeconomic issues in the future, just as it was the case in the last several centuries. Without going into specifics, the question I would like to ask you in this regard, just to let you touch upon these issues, is how exactly would you assess China's economic and security relations with these particular countries? Like I said, it's a very interesting case because they are also NATO members. And in a more broader context, do you think that there are actually different approaches by the NATO members? And if that's the case, what exactly is the diverging line between NATO members when it comes to their view on China?
Very good. Let me start in reverse because I want to start with the diverging, because then I want to start with the diverging line, because I think that's really, really important, particularly for the Black Sea. And when we think about the previous question on opportunities, I think for NATO and for the European Union, when thinking of European Union security, I think that's going to be the perfect region to actually find areas of cooperation, and where China can be more there has opportunities to offer both NATO and the EU, and doesn't pose as many security, or I should say, as many challenges, not just security challenges, but economic challenges. So within there seems to be, when we look within the sort of the two debates, there seems to be 2 points of divergence within the members. They are on whether NATO should have a China policy and on how to address the challenges that China poses to the alliance. Given the COVID environment, I think the post-COVID period will witness the development of a NATO-China policy, which I've already mentioned. As for addressing the challenges and the type of mechanisms for that, as I mentioned, I'm not a NATO specialist, so I hesitate to offer my recommendations. This is where I want to talk about Ian Brzezinski. He recently added his voice to some of the other calls by analysts for establishment of a NATO-China Council in an article that he wrote for the Atlantic Council, which was just released just the other day. He proposed the creation of a Center for Excellence and a small military headquarters to be established in the Indo-Pacific in order for NATO members to have a better understanding of the region. Having lived in the Asia-Pacific for 7 years, I think the NATO-China Council and the establishment of a Center of Excellence is a great idea. He suggests that Beijing might not be open to the NATO-China Council. However, I think the government might be open to that, particularly given that Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently said that China welcomes dialogue with NATO, and more specifically welcomes dialogue with NATO on equal footing. As I've said before, there are some common grounds for strategic security dialogue between the two, and I think that it's in the wider Black Sea when we look at the nature of China's economic and security relations with those countries. And so that's why I focused in that piece more specifically on the 4 NATO countries. And as you know, for our project, I have focused on, I've covered all of the 11, with minus Russia, because that's in a separate section, all 11 BSEC countries with that. And I grouped them into 2 different areas, the NATO area, then the Guam area, and then the other. And so there was really, it was fascinating in looking at, when we look at the patterns across those, and this again reinforces why I said I'm really excited that the wider Black Sea has the potential to be an area of opportunity for China and NATO and the European Union. So with that, let me talk about the 4 countries individually, and then I want to do sort of a little bit of a cross-case analysis and then come back to some of the things regarding that Ian Brzezinski had highlighted about the creation of a Center for Excellence. So first, as many of your viewers may be aware, China and Turkey first established their relationship in 1971. There was a gradual increase in the nature of economic and security relations beginning in the 1980s. Their relationship was elevated in 2013 to a strategic partnership, but the strategic part of their relationship is limited to economic relations, which consists primarily of trade and investment. They trade primarily in manufacturing, industrial, consumer, and agricultural goods. The manufacturing goods make up the most of the imports. The total imports began to decline in 2017, while the volume of exports remained the same. Industrial goods are the goods that are mostly exported from Turkey to China. And the trade imbalance, just like with the other countries, it has been not just a point of contention, but it also favors China. In terms of investment, China has provided Turkey with loans for some of the infrastructural projects, such as the metro lines. It supported its request for funding in the Trans-Anatolia natural gas pipeline project. It invested in Turkey's logistics, telecommunications, and manufacturing, and conducted currency swaps and signed banking agreements. In military and security relations, China has the most extensive security relations with Turkey than with the other countries that focused here. More specifically, their relationship consists of high to low level personnel exchanges, limited military training exercises, weapons sales and assistance with Turkey's development of weapons and space capabilities, security and intelligence cooperation, and commitments made for cooperation on non-traditional security threats. Now turning to Romania, China-Romanian relations have evolved since they were first established in 1949, but there have been significantly higher levels of economic and security cooperation in the Cold War period, and more economic cooperation than security cooperation in the post-Cold War period. Economic relations between the two countries consist of trade and manufacturing, industrial, consumer goods, and investments in energy, industry, real estate, transport, infrastructure, and telecommunications. Manufacturing goods were the top imports. The imports have increased since 2013, with there being a significant jump in trade between 2017 and 2018 and a slight decline in 2019. Maybe let me pause here for just a second, because you may be wondering, why am I emphasizing the start date of the nature of the increase in their imports and as well as their exports? And this is because what I was really looking at, it was because in 2013, as everyone is aware, that's when the BRI policy was initiated. And so I wanted to see what is in the fact that, do we in fact see an increase in trade relations as well as investment in that period, in the BRI period? And in fact, across the cases, you do see that. You then do see fluctuations in between, but then also most of them in terms of imports and exports have another increase in around the years of 2017 and 18. Now, going back to Romania, the industrial goods are the top exports. Exports have experienced more fluctuation in their levels. What's important to note, though, is that they experienced also an increase in 2013. Chinese investments in the country target energy, industry, infrastructure, real estate, the information technology, and communication. Again, I want to pause here and talking about investments, because what I was looking for here was the nature of were Chinese investments diversified? Is there diversification? Because I was thinking, well, if there's diversification, well, then we can really assess whether or not the nature of China's relationship is actually an economic security challenge for not just NATO, but those countries itself. And as I'll talk about once I get to doing the cross-case analysis, is that in fact the investments themselves are diversified in the BSEC region and among the NATO countries itself, thus allowing us to make the assumption that they're not that the nature of China's trade and security relations with those countries do not per se pose an economic security threat. Military and security relations between these two countries consist primarily of high-level military to military and security personnel contact, limited bilateral training exercises, and cooperation in UN peacekeeping missions. Now, again, let me pause here. When I was looking at military and security relations, what I really wanted to be able to understand was because of the concern with the espionage and all of that, I wanted to be able to see what is the nature of the security relationship, and does China actually pose a hybrid security challenge to not just to the individual countries, but then also to the region itself. Now, when we look at Bulgaria, the Bulgarian-China relations were first established in 1949, and they've remained cordial until the 1980s, which is when the first set of cooperative agreements were signed. In 2019, relations were upgraded to a strategic partnership. Economic and military and security relations have remained minimal in relation to China's relations with larger, wealthier European countries and non-EU member states, despite the upgrade. And I would note that Bulgaria is a country that has preferred would like to have better relations with China. Economic relations consist of trade and manufacturing, industrial and consumer goods, and investment in agricultural, business, energy, media technology, and transport infrastructure. The manufacturing goods are top imports and exports. Imports saw an increase in 2013 and 14, some fluctuation between 2015 and 17, a significant increase in 2018. Exports also increased in 2013 and a gradual decline in 2014 and 16. Military and security relations consist primarily of military to military high-level dialogue and exchanges. In Albania, the relations have fluctuated over the years since they were first established. I won't go through the period of when they had formally ended relations, but the relationship today has improved. The relationship consists of economic relations, and they don't have a military or security relationship, neither has either party indicated their desire to create a military or security relationship. Their economic relations consist primarily of trade and consumer, manufacturing, industrial and agricultural goods, and investment in agriculture and energy and transportation infrastructure. Manufacturing goods are both the top imports and exports, and the trade imbalance favors China. Just like the other ones, the imports gradually increased during in the post 2013 period. Now, when I look across those cases, and also I'll add what's not I didn't discuss in that article was in relation to the larger BSEC region. So when we look at these countries in relation to the other BSEC countries, we find that China trades more with the NATO BSEC members than the other regional groupings like Guam. For those of you who are not familiar with that, Guam stands for the regional organizations comprising of Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova. With the NATO BSEC group, Turkey's the dominant trade partner. Manufacturing goods make up the bulk of its goods traded with the entire group, and they are followed by consumer and agricultural products. Second, Chinese investments are diversified across the BSEC countries, with there being even more diversification in investments among the NATO BSEC members. Among the NATO BSEC members, transport infrastructure and energy are the two top sectors for investment. But what's really interesting when looking at the nature of transport and energy, when you think of Europe, because you think about the nature of the European, more specifically the EU's dependence on Russia for energy, and the Black Sea region as an alternative energy source or for energy diversification within that. And so China has targeted the infrastructure in that capacity to be able to help to facilitate energy production. And more specifically, I should say, it's alternative energy that most of its investments have been in, as opposed to your traditional investments. And so going to, when you think of the nature of the type of energy that Russia exports versus energy within the region, you don't necessarily see the potential for competition, or I should say conflict, not competition, but conflict with Chinese investments in alternative energies. And the transport infrastructure, there was really fascinating when looking at the investments in the transport infrastructure, because it's not just targeting the energy, but then also for shipment of goods, and which highlights the importance of the growing importance of the European market for China's economic growth. And so I think it's, again, another is important when looking at that. But then when you think about the nature of the diversification of it, outside of transport and infrastructure, the other areas of investments are agriculture, telecommunication, business, manufacturing, real estate, telecommunications, logistics, media, and technology. But none of the investments themselves have been significantly smaller than Chinese investment in the stronger or more dominant EU countries. So I think that's important to highlight when we're thinking about whether or not China is perceived as a threat in that regard. Third, China's military and security relations among the BSEC members are not extensive except for its relations with Turkey. They're primarily defined by training exercises, weapon sales and assistance, and personal exchanges, contact, and dialogue. So your traditional military to military relations when attempting to assess them. Fourth, China's relations with NATO BSEC members do not pose a national security threat to NATO, and in my opinion, when looking at the nature of the relationship. And so
Mhm. This is quite an extending research, and I'm really looking forward to the next publications based on what you've just outlined. For a short version, like I said, the audience can go to the article on the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs webpage, NATO, China, and the BSEC 4. So given these insights, and given these findings, what does that actually mean for the debates within NATO and Europe? And you mentioned also the European counterparts um, on how to approach China in a post-COVID-19 context. And coupled with that, my final question, because we actually already reached the 60 minutes format, but I'm eager to hear your opinion on these final questions, is what do you expect is going to be likely the reality in the post-COVID-19 period regarding US-China relations?
Let me start with the first one in terms of the debates, the findings in the debates. I think as I mentioned, the wider Black Sea region is an excellent area for where both NATO and Europe can find some common ground with China. Beijing's trade and investment is not per se a threat to the alliance or even to European security when we break down the different types of goods that are traded. So when I went through the agriculture, consumer, manufacturing, if you actually break them down, you're able to see more specifically why I said that it's not per se that China doesn't per se pose a threat to both the alliance and European security. The diversification of its investments suggests that there's little threat, meaning, and then more specifically, that you're not likely to see Beijing influencing their behavior. On this note, and this is where I want to come back to the Center for Excellence. There have been few studies outside of the region that look at the use of economic coercion or economic statecraft to directly influence politics. But they have not been comprehensive and instead been more on single case studies. We can't draw broad sweeping generalizations from single case studies. Ultimately, there just simply is not enough cross case studies to adequately say that Beijing is using economic coercion and economic statecraft to be able to influence their political decisions outside, but we have to, because like I said, there are some single cases, but whether or not this is it's being done in the context of economic statecraft, we don't have enough case studies and data to be able to say whether or not confidently that is the case. My concern is that in the present environment, particularly with heightened U.S. tensions, that actors will utilize the period in order to potentially push agendas or to propose policies that are short rather than long-term oriented. NATO is a unique organization, and it needs to look at and propose policies for the long term. And given the debates, I think that NATO itself is going to it's going to take time for NATO to be able to develop a long-term policy towards China. But it looks, because of the convergence of the debates in the post-COVID period, I think again, as I mentioned previously, you're going to have a NATO-China policy. Going back to what Brzezinski had suggested, a center of excellence in the region could help to fill the information gap and facilitate dialogue on both the opportunities and challenges that China poses to NATO. So now, taking this to wrap this up and looking back at the nature of US-China relations in a post-COVID period, I think that a competitive, cooperative approach is here to stay. And the reason you notice that I changed that there, because then in Washington, the strategic document specifically says a competitive approach, but when you actually read the text of it, it has in there that the nature of cooperating with Beijing on areas of mutual interest. And so I think we're back to it's the competitive cooperative approach. But what is really going to is the hallmark and the actual change itself is the recognition that Beijing is that the nature of our relationship is one of great power competition, which is significant because the past administrations have not recognized Beijing at that, and so it's basically, if we go back to President Xi's speech on international relations and major power relations, it's basically saying, okay, we accept now that that this is one of major power competition. Domestic politics and the economy, I think, are going to be the focal point for both countries in the immediate post-COVID environment. At the same time, I think they'll both need to find a way to cooperate multilaterally, even if independently, in order to stabilize the global economy. And I think you see some of this in the present COVID period, right? You see, because although it would have been more ideal, like in the past administration, I think you would have been able to have China and the United States working hand in hand in order to address the global needs as a result of COVID. But now what you see, and in this period, you see both countries working in a multilateral framework, but independently from one another. And I think that we're going to see more of that. And I think you're going to see you're going to see, again, in that dynamic, you're going to see the cooperation and competition imbued in all policy actions. I suspect that there are going to be more tense moments in U.S.-China relations, regardless of who wins the election, whether it's Trump or whether it's Biden. I think that, and again, to be able, the reason I base this is because when we think about the nature of sanctions, when we think about some human rights, those are traditional foreign policy issues that Congress leads more on than the White House. And so there's a congressional component in this, in the nature of the relationship, that is going to continue driving some specific issues, regardless. I think if it's Biden as opposed to Trump, you may see less of that confrontational approach that has been prevalent within the Trump administration. But I still think the nature, the shift in and of itself has been solidified in our relationship. I believe that China is going to focus more on Europe in the near future and working toward bettering its relations with the European Union. Although the U.S. relationship still remains Beijing's most important bilateral relationship, I think it recognizes right now, particularly in the lead up and the aftermath of the U.S. elections, there will be little that can be done to improve relations, and business and people-to-people relations between the U.S. and China will remain strong despite the tension. And I believe Beijing realizes their importance for bettering U.S. and China relations in the long term. And you see this, think just to what has occurred in the last couple of days, where with the U.S. banning Chinese airlines to the U.S. And rather than a tit-for-tat action, Beijing says, okay, but we won't do the same thing. So I think that to reinforce that point there, I think Beijing realizes that it's going to focus its attention right now on Europe, as opposed to focusing on bettering relations with the United States. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be dialogue. There's not going to be movement in trade. I believe that the Trump administration will attempt before the election period to move forward with trade negotiations between the two countries.
Now, obviously, there is going to be a further debate on both sides of the Atlantic, in the United States, but also in Europe, when it comes to the future relationship with China. On this side of the Atlantic, here in Europe, already in 2019, the European Commission outlined in its strategic outlook that China is economic competitor, a cooperation partner, an economic competitor, and a strategic rival all together. So it's a very multifaceted approach, so to say. And obviously, from what you've been outlining based on the strategic documents in the United States, but also based on your research, on your recent research, there are challenges, and the sum of these challenges might result in a kind of a potential strategic threat scenario coming from China, but it also might create synergies and new opportunities for a new kind of a cooperation relationship. So it's quite open on both sides and in both directions. And we should be very realistic about it. And we should try not to go into, solely into the one direction, risking to use the opportunities and neglecting actually potential opportunities. But we should also be very realistic, or as the last paper by the White House stresses, it's a new kind of a pragmatic realism approach, which I think that some of the European member states will also apply in their relations with China. Dear Rachel, thank you very much for taking the time to touch upon all of these issues, and I wish you good luck with your further research on these topics, and I warmly thank you for being with me in the last 70 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.